unfortunately, I sort of revised my talk, and I decided I'd make it more specific and more general at the same time, if that's possible. So it's more specific in the sense that I'm not really going to talk about music and music perception and brain rhythms in general, but rather focus on a particular study that was conceived in the context of trying to better understand what they might be. And more general in the sense that I'm going to talk about speech perception as well and compare that with results from our music experiment. So just to give you an overview of this particular project, I have two primary collaborators, Oded Ghitza from Boston University and David Purple, who's in neuroscience at NYU. And both of them are speech researchers. I'm, of course, in music perception, so that's kind of the two angles we're coming from here. And of course, you know, studies regarding comparisons between language or speech and music are really popular, especially now in neuroscience. So I'm going to discuss that, you know, in general a little bit at the end of my talk if I have time in the context of this project. But anyway, so the work I'm going to talk about today, the main goal is to develop a better understanding of the timescales at which the brain processes musical structure. And then to compare those timescales to those that are implicated for speech in prior work. And the methodology combines approaches from two earlier studies, the first one on speech by Ghitza and Greenberg from 2009, and then a recent study that I published with Gary Marcus and David Purple recently on key finding. So this is how it all kind of fits together. Ghitza and Greenberg in 2009, they published this paper on decoding of speech, and this particular study was motivated by the perspective role played by brain rhythms in speech perception. So what they did was take semantically unpredictable sentences. So basically nonsensical sentences that were grammatically correct, I suppose. And what they wanted to find out was what were the possible packaging rates, or basically periodic cycles of audio, and in this case audio and silences, that would best enable listeners to understand the words in these semantically unpredictable sentences. And possibly also, you know, if there was some kind of oscillatory mechanism that was aligned with these rates. So what they did was they took these sentences and compressed them. So they were 3 times as fast, but the pitch remained the same. And when subjects were asked to identify the words, 6 to 8 words, the accuracy decreased by a great deal. So for example, regular speech, it was pretty much 98% accuracy, regular, the original tempo, I suppose, or rate. And in the case of the compressed sequences, it was around 50%. So definitely, they're degrading the signal in some way, compressing it, and performance gets a lot worse. But now their question was, well, what if silences were inserted every 40 seconds into the audio? And as you can see from this graph over here, this is actually from a paper by Ghitza that he published in 2011, but it kind of summarizes the data well, so I put it here. What they found was that when they started inserting silences every 40 milliseconds, so this is 20 to 160 milliseconds of silence, performance actually improved. So they're taking a signal, they're degrading it by compressing it. So theoretically speaking, if you degrade it even further by just randomly inserting silences, shouldn't the performance get worse? But in fact, it didn't get worse. You get this U-shaped error curve where as silences get inserted, performance improves and it reaches the optimum level of performance at around 80 milliseconds of silence added. And you can see above there it says 8.3 hertz, that's the packaging rate. So that's really 120 milliseconds, so it's the 80 seconds plus the audio segment, which is 40 milliseconds. So there's this nice U-shaped curve, and it suggests there's some kind of oscillatory mechanism for speech with a preferred packaging rate, this periodic cycles of audio plus silence, of 6 to 17 hertz. So the idea was that they thought perhaps that optimum intelligibility of speech is achieved when the syllable rhythm within the range of high theta frequency brain rhythms, so comparable to the rate at which segments and syllables are articulated in conversational speech. So that's when the optimum intelligibility is achieved. Okay, so the next experiment was the key finding experiment I mentioned that I did with my co-authors. That had to do with rate, not necessarily decoding time, but rate and the perception of musical structure, in this case, key finding. So this study, well, there was a preliminary study to this where 6 music theorists and composers were asked to judge the key of 30-some-odd melodic sequences. And these melodic sequences were peculiar in that they were statistically ambiguous with respect to 2 keys, 2 closely related keys. So for example, they contained all the pitch classes in C major and G major. So like all the white notes plus F sharp. So the last note in this untransposed C, G major example was always G. So it could either be interpreted as the tonic of one key or the dominant of the other. And all the other pitches could be rearranged in any order. So the idea is that you would use strong structural cues, control for the effect of statistical distributions of pitch classes to prefer one key over another, and ask musically trained subjects to say whether the last note sounded like a tonic or a dominant. So that way you can kind of indirectly get at what key they thought a particular sequence was in. So aside from that, for this particular study, all of these sequences, there were 10 total. So out of the original 30, we chose the 10 where there was the most agreement between theorists and composers. And in this case, the 5 on the left are the ones that sounded most like C major, and the ones on the right are the ones that sounded like G major. So then we parametrically varied the tempi of the sequences, and it was a really wide range. It varied from 7 beats per minute, which is dreadfully slow, to 34 beats per minute, which just sounded like a blob of notes, practically speaking. So it was a really wide range. And so we considered a response correct in this case if it matched the key that was previously labeled by the experts. So what did we find? Well, we found actually a very similar U-shaped curve, except in this case it's an upside down U-shaped curve because this is performance rather than error, but it's the same idea. And we kind of tried to put that into perspective, both in terms of music perception thresholds as well as speech constants or thresholds. So what we found was that listeners robustly identified key at note event rates between 0.5 and 7 hertz, so between 30 to 400 beats per minute, 150 to 2,000 milliseconds inner onset interval. And what's interesting is if you look at that graph over there, the high end overlaps with the range for optimal speech intelligibility. However, speech goes a little higher than that. And there's a lower range, which is considerable for music, that goes way below the optimal speech intelligibility lower bound. What's interesting also is that this range spans almost precisely with the range in which beat induction and melody recognition occurs. So this is all well and good. However, there's an unresolved question here. And that is that although it appears that key finding is essentially limited by rhythmic and melodic constraints, which makes sense, obviously, right? The actual decoding time for tonal processing, which is, of course, it depends on actually understanding the musical structure in the melody, that actual decoding time is unknown. And just from informal observations, when I saw some of the subjects in this experiment, it was rather peculiar. For the very fast sequences, there's always a longer pause at the end, where they kind of either rehearsed it again in their heads or sort of thought about it for a little bit, and then finally made a decision. Even if their choice was accurate relative to the expert's opinion, there was still this delay almost, and it was a little bit peculiar. But that might also reflect the fact that decoding time is not the same as actually being able to comprehend a particular melodic sequence and then making a decision at some point on what the key actually is. Okay, so we took those two studies, combined the methodologies, and came up with a study to use Ghitza and Greenberg's silence insertion paradigm, but with the sequences, the melodic sequences from the key finding experiment. So our original sequences were 60 beats per minute, and we compressed that 28 times, so that's a lot more than the 3 times for the speech. So the compressed audio was at 1680 beats per minute, which is, reasonably incomprehensible, I would say, or a note event rate of 35.7 milliseconds each. So I'll play you an example of an original sequence. Oops. Oh, that's strange. Is my audio not connected? Oh, it's this one? Oh, I thought it was connected here. All right, sorry about that. So here's the original sequence. And here's an example of a compressed sequence. So what we did is, like in the case of Ghitza and Greenberg, we inserted silences. Now, Ghitza and Greenberg had aperiodic and periodic silences inserted. The thing about music is that note onsets are isochronous, so it has its own rhythm to begin with. So what we did instead is we sort of made it aperiodic by varying the audio segment length in addition to the silence length. So the audio segment durations range between 10 milliseconds and 65 milliseconds, with the 38 millisecond case being pretty much dividing that sequence almost precisely into the compressed note events. And the silence durations were a wider range than for the speech case of between 40 and 1280 milliseconds. So just to give you an example of what some of these compressed sequences sounded like with the insertions of silence, here's a 10 millisecond long audio segment duration with a silence duration of 40 milliseconds. And here's kind of the other end, 65 millisecond audio with gap duration of 640 milliseconds. I think it was missing the last part. There's something wrong with the audio. Anyway, you get the idea. They don't sound particularly musical, but we asked them the same task, same question. We asked them to listen to all of these combinations of silence and audio durations and to judge basically whether a sequence ended on an implied tonic or dominant. They also heard the original 60 beats per minute sequence and the compressed sequence without silences twice. So that was kind of the baseline. So here are the results. So the error rate for the compressed sequences without silence was pretty much chance. It's 45% error rate, borderline chance, as to be expected. Now, instead of basing the correctness of the answer on experts' opinions, we based it on their own opinions of each sequence, because it's not like speech where a word is a word, right? People do have different opinions as to what key something could be, and especially when with this very restricted sort of melodic stimuli. So if they basically agreed with themselves in the best case scenario, which is like the 60 beat per minute uncompressed original sequence, then we basically checked their responses against that baseline, their own baseline, and that's how we determined whether they chose something that was correct or incorrect. Anyway, so as you can see from the data, it's broken up by audio segment durations. So the top line is a black line, the 10 millisecond, blue line is 23 millisecond, and so on. And the x-axis here is the silence durations that were inserted for each of those audio segments, and then the error rate. Now, first of all, even with the addition of the 40 and 80 milliseconds of silence, there is mostly a small increase in performance. But as you can see, especially in the case of the 38 millisecond audio segments, there's a really marked increase in performance, especially around the 320 millisecond insertion of silences. Now, for the case of 10 milliseconds, clearly there's no performance. In fact, it gets worse after a certain point. But I believe part of the problem there is pitch perception, because 10 milliseconds is not a lot of time to detect pitch. And in fact, there was a pretty wide range of transpositions. So there was the original sequence, and then you could have 11 semitones down or 11 semitones up. That was all done randomly. And the 23 milliseconds is kind of in the middle, where it doesn't seem to be following the same trend as the 38 millisecond or above, where there is clear improvement. But maybe that's a function of the pitch range, the frequency ranges. However, when I looked at the 23 millisecond case alone and divided it into performance by low pitch versus high pitch, you can see that for the higher transpositions, indeed, performance is better. But it still follows the same trend, pretty much, more or less, as the lower pitch. But it does have that more distinct U shape. It's simply not as good as the 38 plus millisecond case. So anyway, so let's look at these two U-shaped curves. The one from Ghitza and Greenberg for speech, and one for music. Now, in this graph, I've only included the 38 plus milliseconds because those were the three cases where there was clear improvement. And as you can see, you have that U-shaped curve, more or less, except the ranges are very different. And you can see that the minimum, or the approximate minimum, is more around 350 milliseconds, maybe 300, something like that. Unlike the case for speech, which is, well, what's marked 80 millisecond insertion interval is 120 milliseconds inner onset interval. So in summary, the insertions of 160 to 640 milliseconds of silence between the audio segments of compressed music significantly reduced error rate. However, the caveat here is that the segments must be long enough, the audio segments must be long enough in duration to enable pitch to actually be discerned. So what does this translate to in terms of packaging rate? If you recall, packaging rate is the audio plus silence interval, periodic interval. So that's a preferred packaging rate of approximately 1.4 to 5.1 hertz. And it suggests a significantly shorter decoding time for speech than for music, at least when you're comparing word recognition to tonal induction, which are two. Okay, here's a problem. The problem here is that a lot of analogs have been made between music and speech. You see a lot of studies about musical syntax, shared resources, neural substrates for processing musical versus language syntax. However, this is more about, musical syntax is still different than language syntax. With language syntax, you have sentence structure that you at some point recognize, and then you recognize, then you see a noun, and how you interpret that depends on how you've parsed the preceding elements of the sentence. And there's a lot of things going on. But the problem here is that for a lot of these studies that have to do with music and language, it's all about having a tonal context and then recognizing when there is some kind of violation of syntax. So for example, you're in C major and you hear some funky chord and it's surprising because it doesn't fit the grammatical or whatever you want to call it, musical context. But that also assumes that you've already done the key finding, you've already accomplished identifying the key, while as what this work is more focused on is how do you actually do that? How much time does it take to determine what key you're in? So it's a little bit different, and it's really more about, so I suppose the underpinnings of how much minimum decoding time is necessary, assuming that we can actually hear the pitch, assuming we can hear the melodic contour, which is of course necessary. How much actual decoding time is necessary. And it seems to be that the optimal rate for this particular music task, if you take the 38 millisecond case at the 320 millisecond silence insertion, is about 2.8 hertz. Interestingly, it's also precisely at the mean word rate for speech. I'm not drawing any conclusions from that. It's just an observation. If you look back at this figure, you can see the mean syllabic, mean word rate are all indicated up there. And 2.8 hertz, 3 hertz is really right in the middle of the mean word rate. Clearly, music and speech have these similar U-shaped error rate curves for the tasks that were involved. However, music has this extensive lower end that's not completely closed. So my guess is that it is closed at some point. It has to be. And perhaps this extends to that 30 beat per minute, 0.5 hertz limit that was shown in the previous key finding experiment. And that would have entailed inserting a lot longer silences, at least 2,000 or so milliseconds of silences, which went considerably beyond the longest duration of 1280 milliseconds explored here. It has been observed that there is a correspondence between average, so this is where the brain rhythms comes in, correspondence between average duration of speech units and frequency ranges of cortical oscillations. So, as an example, phonetic features are associated with gamma and beta oscillations. Syllables and words, a mean duration of 250 milliseconds, are associated with theta oscillations. And then, most relevant to what we're looking at here, the delta range oscillations, sequences of syllables and words embedded within a prosodic phrase. That's like 500 to 2,000 milliseconds. So that's been associated with delta oscillations. So the question is, does that mean tonal induction is related to how we process prosody? Maybe. I mean, they both have to do with pitch detection to some, or the contour detection to some extent. But anyway, I mean, this is just an observation. I really don't know what it means, except to say that making analogies between musical structures and language structures is really difficult, because a word is not necessarily a chord, or a sentence is not necessarily a phrase, and certainly the way the brain processes these structures is probably different. Or maybe it's not. Or maybe there's some overlap. And so I'm just kind of throwing that out there. And of course, key induction and parsing of harmony in a tonal context are not exactly the same either. So there are all these differences that we have to think about. I'm sorry if this sounds very unresolved, but I think I'm out of time, so thank you.